Hello and welcome. This is another TightOps chat, this time featuring Jimmy Hayes from Minaal, the famous company for travel accessories, bags mostly. Jimmy, welcome.
Thank you.
We've been meeting, I think, back in 2012. That was before you started Minaal. I think you already had the name Minaal, but you at that time, your main product was a travel shirt, which was pretty nice. And people then at the DC BKK conference sort of convinced you should make a bag. And what a bag you made. Um, a very famous minimalist travel bag. And you have been running your company remote only, distributed since the start. How has that turned out so far, and how are you coping with the current situation around the COVID-19 crisis?
Thank you. Well, that was a very kind introduction. I think if we go to 2012 and go to about 3 months ago, that was quite a linear line. Tools got better. Ways of collapsing time zones got better. In general, it was just a slow, steady path of improvement for remote work and making it easier to do remote work. And then, obviously, as with almost everything else, everything changed. And I think that progress is obviously still happening in the same ways that it was. But at least for us, the biggest change has been the volatility and the velocity of the work cycles has just shifted in a huge way. And so, whereas before it might have been okay to take a week to make a decision or 2 weeks to deliver a mini project or whatever it is, or have a catch up every week with your operations person, suddenly that's hours or 24 hours or less. And so I think it's in the need to be more nimble and reactive to a really rapidly changing set of sort of situations. We have been communicating much more frequently, but in a much more light way. So rather than having an all hands call every couple of weeks, it's more like touching base one-to-one every couple of days. And so that's probably been the biggest change. I think it's just the how rapid we've needed to be with communication to keep up with the rapidity of how quickly things are changing.
So increased frequency for sure, communication frequency.
Yeah.
And how has your setup progressed, and at which point on that journey did you feel that this is now becoming a real company? You started out with your co-founder running a very big Kickstarter at that time, and then how did that progress? At which point did you feel like, oh, now we're actually running a company and I got to take care of managing and maybe be concerned with company culture and these kinds of things?
Yeah, it's interesting the way you phrase that, because we launched on Kickstarter at crowdfunding, and that first campaign was successful. We hit the target on the first day with our first campaign, and that was our very first launch. So we weren't public before that. And that didn't feel like a real company. So at 5 a.m. and getting really excited, there was a dawning realization of, oh wow, we really have to deliver now. But it wasn't. It was still just the two of us, and we needed to continue along the same path that we'd been going along anyway. This is a strange one, but I think the time when I first felt what you described is early on. We used HipChat as our chat software. I don't know if I should say HipChat rest in peace, but it's something along those lines. And HipChat, we had about a 3-person team at that point. And for some reason, we thought it was a really good idea that everyone would be in their own channel, but not anyone else's channel. And the only people that would be in those different channels was me and Doug, my business partner. And so we had one person in support, and there was a 3-person channel, and then another
Mm-hmm.
person in content, and that was a 3-person channel, another person in product, there was a 3-person channel. And looking back on it, even 6 months or 3 months after we changed that, it felt insane. Like, why would you not want people communicating with each other when so much of their work relies on the other person?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it was when we integrated everyone together that it suddenly became more than just this kind of ragtag bunch of people doing things in separate hip chat channels. So there was, yeah, that was a really weird time to feel that, but it was definitely the time where I first felt it. Just seeing everyone start to interact independently of Doug and I.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps a bit of just rewind a bit and just kind of put a few pieces into place of what the company structure is, because it's not just a digital company, it actually produced something real. So there's obviously going to be some touch points with kind of a physical location. So if I understand correctly, you've got like a pretty geographically diverse team. Sounds like you and Doug are, changing your location every couple of months.
Less so
And
now.
well, yeah, perhaps a bit stationary for the time being. But the other members of your team I've met, it seems like people are pretty much anywhere. So there must be some people who have specific kind of location dependencies. But maybe that's not, maybe it's just popping into a factory twice a year or something. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about the kind of dependent and independent location dependence and independence in the company.
Mm. It's probably easy to list off the location dependent stuff because there's much less of it. And then everything else you can kind of assume it's location independent, because the initial idea was to create a location independent company. And with physical products, you quickly find out which parts are not uh, suitable for that. Or you don't find it out quickly and you find it out 6 years later that, oh, wow, this would have been a lot better to be doing in person all that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think something that doesn't require in-person work but really benefits from it is product iteration. So we can do ideation pretty well remotely. We can do initial sketches and responses pretty well. But once we're getting into sample territory, once we're talking about the changes we might want to make that are really granular to a bag or any sort of product, that starts becoming a lot faster in person. The iteration cycles remotely are very long. Say we have one sample bag and we're sending it between 4 different countries to be reviewed by 4 different people. Even sending that takes 3 to 5 days, and so then you're starting to add on 4, 5, 6 times the amount of time needed just to go through the discussion of what we should be doing with the product. That's the first thing. Then once we get to quality control, that obviously has to be done in person. So going into our manufacturing partner and physically opening the bags and checking every single one is another one that is so far not possible through VR or anything else. So we'll be doing it in person. And then any sort of, and this is kind of a check question because it's not necessary, but any sort of in-person interaction with users. So if we want to get feedback that relies on us kind of pulling apart the bag and seeing how people use it, you can do it remotely, but the value that we've found in that, and even just the relationships that we've formed by talking through products with people in person, has shown us that it's worth the moment. And I guess the last thing I'd say is just
Right.
team stuff. We do, I think, pretty well at operating remotely, but I definitely agree to some extent with whoever it was that said relationships are built in person and maintained online. I don't think you have to do that. I don't think that everybody's personality needs that. But for our particular culture or group of people, um, just having that initial meetup to get everyone on the same page, or hanging out, or just knowing each other's persona, and then going from there into this online collaboration I've definitely noticed that we have improved our collaboration after those in-person times.
So you're a fan of the so-called company retreat, where you'll kind of get together for period?
I am, and I was more so. I'm less so now in terms of the specifics of what you think of when you think of retreats. So we have in the past done full team retreats, and they've been a total blast, in my opinion. We've had amazing times. It's totally been worth the investment. What we've shifted to is a much more opportunistic model and a much more nimble and more frequent model. So it's we call them meetups instead of retreats, and that might be I'm going to the same country that our operations manager is in, so of course we're going to meet up and talk through stuff. Or our support person happens to be traveling through the country that I'm in, so of course we'll get together and talk about that stuff. And maybe it's more than one-on-one, right? Maybe there's two people quite close to each other in Europe, and then I'm also passing through Europe, and so the three of us should get together. And we generally know our schedules far enough in advance that we can actually plan that pretty well and make sure that we don't go too long without that happening. And so far, I think, despite the fun that I had at the retreats, the outcomes of those meetups have been more impactful than the original full team retreats.
Right, so those must be much more frequent, maybe less hassle organizing and much more frequent.
I think the admin and logistics load to get, whatever it is, let's say 10 people in one place is exponentially more than getting five people in one place. So it's interesting that it doesn't scale linearly. You can't just say, oh well, it's 10 people instead of 5, that's double the work. It's actually mind-bendingly difficult to find something that works for everyone, and you start running into all sorts of issues that didn't crop up when you were at a smaller stage.
That's a real good takeaway for me, because we've been trying to do annual full team retreats, and the logistics are just so complex. Like, now the team's quite big, just finding accommodation which we can all finding a place where we can get accommodation. It's in the good old days we could just get a small Airbnb kind of anywhere. Now it's like we need to kind of book 2 or 3, make sure they're near each other. Stuff like dietary requirements kind of spin out of control. And so,
well, it's very easy. It's very easy to get 3 people into a restaurant on a Friday night. It's not so easy to get 15, 20 people into a restaurant on a Friday night. So our world is made for certain group sizes, right? And as soon as you go over some of those normal limitations, that starts getting much more difficult. It's like a wedding or something, right? As soon as you try and start throwing an event for 80 people, there's a lot more additional cost that's baked into it.
And since you mentioned it, what is your solution, and how did you solve the physical product sample checking? Like, how do you get the 4 people together to look at the product samples then? What has been because you said you can't just send it from one country to the next.
Unfortunately, there still is a bit of sending it from one country to the next. Ideally, that wouldn't happen, but if we're far enough ahead on the design cycle, we can actually afford that extra time. If we're trying to move fast, we just get together in person, and we usually try and schedule that so it makes sense. So maybe there's a design meeting at the same time that we're doing quality control, so we can kind of double up, right? Or maybe we're working on 3 different things in 3 different stages of the cycle. There's an ideation meeting, there's a sample review meeting, and there's quality control. So the more things we can kind of stack up, and we're getting better at it now that we know we're going to have something coming up, we can start working towards that and thinking, what other stuff are we making that could be from bundling that together. And it doesn't even have to be the same kind of work mode, right? We could have a product meetup for a few days, and then the designer leaves, but the rest of the people stay on and talk about operations or whatever it might be. So it really is just thinking ahead, which we haven't been particularly good at for quite a while, and we're getting better at now. And also just stacking things on top of each other, knowing that we might not get a chance to talk about it in person for a while.
And Jimmy, how has your personal role changed over those years? I mean, doing everything in the beginning, it was all hands-on. And I think you also did very great job at marketing and doing this Kickstarter. You became at least temporary, how to do a successful Kickstarter expert. as a side hustle. People wanted to know how you did it, but how I'm interested in what were the things that you're now able to delegate and that you actually maybe found other people can perform or do better, and what are the things that have there's a good word here, transpired to be your core competencies, where you feel most comfortable and have the biggest value add to the entire organization.
So the last part is the key part, because for me, that realization, because I'm okay at everything. I'm not great really at anything, but I can kind of do most things okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing that I can do okay is operation stuff. I can make sure that things are happening when they need to happen. Checklists, following up with people, cracking the whip, whatever it might be. The problem is I'm not great at it, and it also doesn't make me happy. And that's a really key thing, right? Do I feel in flow when I'm doing
Mm-hmm.
this work? And for operation stuff, the answer is definitely no. And so it took a long time, a surprisingly long time, to recognize that. I thought that I was doing fine, and then there's a bit of burnout that crept in because it wasn't something that I felt in flow with. It didn't energize me; it drained me, and because I was doing so much of it, it was an unsustainable path. And so the way I framed it and realized it was, every minute that I spend doing this thing that I'm not fantastic at and I don't enjoy is a minute that I'm not doing the things which I really do enjoy and I'm probably better at, which is the creative stuff. So marketing, copywriting, talking to customers, anything that involves people, and kind of learning and creating content, all that sort of stuff. So it was just and it sounds so basic to say it now, but just understanding that I really do have limited time, and those things are a trade-off, and I should really aggressively try and move out of stuff that I'm okay at, and concentrate all of my time on the things that I'm actually decent at.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And another aspect that I think we touched on, but I want to hear your perspective. This is something that is quite unfamiliar to me, and maybe also to Chris, who we are both running companies that deliver services or digital content products. You have a physical product, and not only that, but you also have a very we discussed this previously, a very vertical integration. You have, as you said, a manufacturing partner, but you are doing a lot of the things from coming up with ideas, designing the products. I'm guessing up to marketing and delivering and so on. Where has this been an advantage, and where is it a limitation? Where would you maybe say, I prefer you don't run your own shop or something like that? What's your take there?
I think by and large it's very positive. I I think there's two really clear advantages. One is that you keep all of the margin from a business perspective. You are able to serve your customers and the users of your product better because you're not having to sacrifice on things just to push it through a distribution channel where people might not have the same incentives or goals as you. So
Mm-hmm.
having that very direct relationship with our users has been probably the number one reason that we've stayed in business, I think. And every part of the design process is aligned with the same incentives of delivering a really amazing experience at the end of it. Um, the other thing is just complexity. The second thing is basically we can run very lean because we don't have to have account managers who deal with wholesalers who then deal with retailers. It's a very, very simple process from start to finish. The flip side of that is, I think, obviously we're not specialists, so we can go through that whole process. And again, it's the doing okay at it, but when it comes to things like selling into retailers, that's not everything that we do, and it takes a lot of activation energy. So I guess I've realized over time that people like wholesalers in some ways, sometimes really earn that cut that they're taking of the margin because they have the pre-existing relationships. They know exactly how the industry works. It's an industry or a part of the industry with really high barriers. And it's not like you can't do it yourself, but the level of effort and expense for a bootstrap company that is needed to push into those new areas is really, really almost prohibitively high. And
Mm-hmm.
so it can make sense to give up margin up front in order to work with those people because they have it all set up already. And so if you're looking to move fast, maybe you want to sacrifice on each unit to prevent yourself from getting into this 3-year slog of trying to figure out how to do retail, um, I think that's probably the main disadvantage, and it's one of the few disadvantages of being totally vertical. I think is that just you are trying to be, especially as again a small bootstrap company, you're trying to do a lot of things, and it really stretches you, and you're not necessarily expert level at any of them, and so it just takes you a bit longer to do everything.
Have you even considered or thought about? I'm just, this is just a maybe a funny thought, but have you ever considered running something like a flagship store, like like opening a small gallery kind of thing where people can come by and take a look at your products?
Yeah. So yes, we've done some in-person stuff. We actually did a pop-up in a bookstore in Tokyo last year, which was really
Mm-hmm.
fun. And in a similar way, I'm most attracted to things that are time bracketed, so they're temporary,
Yes.
and also things that are interesting. That it's not just I want to sell you some stuff, so come and see us. I would much rather do really interesting things like do a pop-up in a Chinese restaurant, do a pop-up in an abandoned bunker, do just stuff that I would be interested in going to as a person, not as someone
Mm-hmm.
who likes to sell bags. And that's not something we're actively working on right now, but it is. I think where we've done well in the past is just when we've started out with the what we find interesting, what do we find fun or funny, and following that rather than thinking how can we sell more bags or accessories. So yeah, I think the in-person thing is really powerful again, especially when you're able to talk to users and see how they use uh, your gear and kind of learn from them in that sense. And I would love to do it in future, but obviously right now it's a little difficult. But in future for sure.
Yeah.
Can I shift the conversation towards the Minaal team? Maybe to kick things off, perhaps you could talk about some of the challenges you've had hiring and building a remote team. Any kind of top tips? Any clever or innovative things you've done to attract the talents? What's it like building a remote team?
Well, I would love to claim there was some cleverness or innovation there, but I think in all honesty, it is kind of baked into it. I think we are lucky to work with some incredible people, and by and large, we're able to work with those people again as a small bootstrap company by being remote and by putting that level of freedom and autonomy and life choices at the forefront of people's career. And so we really just piggyback on the fact that we're open to people working from anywhere. Um, Obviously, there are some things that are time zone dependent, order pro to a certain extent, but we make a big deal about the fact that we will work with people in any time zone, and as long as you have an internet connection and you're really results focused, then we're open to it. So, I mean, I'm sure there are some small things that we do differently from everyone else, but I think it all starts with that premise of it doesn't matter where you are. It just matters. I think there's. I'm almost paraphrasing Backstreet Boys song, but there's this very attractive proposition that comes into it where we can just say, hey, you can work from anywhere. You choose where you live. You choose the hours that you work. and all that matters is the work you produce and the output that you push out. And I think our job is not to generate that, but to facilitate it. So as much as we can just facilitate people living the life that we want to live, that they want to live, sorry, and doing great work, then that's our job done.
And do you have?
And
any...
I wish I had some great tips and tricks
No.
or whatever, but it really is just piggybacking on the remote thing.
That's cool. And are there any cornerstones to your usual work arrangements, such as do you limit or do you control? That would be the from the one end, or limit, for example, the number of hours people work per week. Do you have any special? Do you prevent people from working on the weekend, or do you have any things in place that you find particularly practical and useful for productivity, as well as for just people's happiness and sanity, that you do within your group, that maybe you have picked up somewhere or come up with yourself?
So I think we never control the hours. People are able to work whatever hours they want, however many, however little, as long as they're hitting their metrics or their KPIs or their whatever they're supposed to be doing and getting done. As long as that's happening, we really don't care. I mean, great. If you could do everything you need to do in 2 hours a week, then fantastic. You're being really efficient, right? And potentially you have then the capacity to level up and take on more work or more interesting work or more valuable work. And so that's what I personally aspire to. I try and do my work in as few hours as possible, because there's no point in extending it out. I think on the other end of that, just like I would think most people running a company, I get concerned when I see someone send something through at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. And actually, it takes quite a lot of self-restraint not to jump in at that point and say, hey, why are you sending through things at that time? And I think there's an argument to be made that we should jump in. But for me, it's internally consistent to say, it's not our business. We're not saying you have to work this many hours. We're not saying where you have to work, whether it's home or cafe or whatever, internet cafe in Japan. And so if people want to sleep during the day and work the night shift, that's completely fine. And I don't think it's a taboo to talk about it, but I really remind myself pretty frequently that people's hours are their own. And if we can just set a good example and consistently give the message that health comes first, well-being comes first, family comes first, we trust people to make good decisions about the hours that they're working. And so it's not an explicit link between those two things, but I would like to think that the values are very clear, and the priorities are very clear, and that hopefully people know that they can come to us if there's an issue, if they're struggling, if they're not liking the hours that they're working or whatever.
How do you recreate the water cooler in the Minaal remote office?
I wish we did better at this, to be honest. I actually I'm quite an in-person person, so in some ways I'm not suited to running this sort of company, but at least it gives me motivation to try and recreate that water cooler. One thing I have is office hours, so I just have an open segment every Friday where anyone can jump on if they want, and either book some time or just jump on. And I mean, my door's buying office hours kind of removes a barrier for people they can chat, and it doesn't need to be about business. It can be about anything. Apart from that, I think one of the things we did, we wanted to respect people's time by starting on time. So if one person was late, we don't wait for them. I think one of the things we did beyond that to generate the water cooler was we said, okay, we will start on time, but if you want to hang out, we'll do it. You just jump on early, because if you do it at the end, which we were doing for a while, it feels weird. Oh, who's jumping off? Do I need to stay? I'm not sure if I stay. It feels this awkward thing. Whereas if it's this opt-in sort of jump on early if you want to hang out 5-10 minutes, whatever, early. That provides that nice optionality, but anyone who's really tight on time can just jump on the hour and be as efficient as they want. So those are two little things that I think have helped. There's not as much uptake on my office hours as I'd hoped, so maybe I'm not as interesting as I thought I was. But
No.
but it is something that you need to keep reminding people about, and re-emphasizing that you're totally open to chatting. I think at any point about anything, because it's very easy to not reach out. There's a serendipity to the water cooler that's very hard to recreate in the digital space.
Yeah, I think I was going to ask you about, as you said, the uptake on the water cooler or on the office hours offering, because I think that's it's a difficult question. Is it already enough to offer that you are available, or and then have people basically have them have to have the initiative to call you up, or should you pre-schedule it? Like, I guess, for example, the BHH and Jason Fried from Basecamp, I think they do like once a month, half an hour or an hour with maybe even every employee. I'm not sure how they regulate it, but they do they say basically, we're going to get on a call for half an hour or maybe longer, and it's not going to be about work, and we're going to be there and we're going to talk about something. So it's, yeah,
I think
it's forced in a different way, but maybe it's also good. I haven't tried it in practice, so I can't really attest to that.
I think about this a lot, and I don't have a good answer. But at the moment, what's moving it in the direction that we're in right now is just that. I think one of our values is just autonomy and independence, and to in a related way, proactivity. And so I think we want to encourage people to be able to reach out, to not rely on us to force things to happen, or to always be the one to instigate it. And I don't know that that's the best thing, but it is something that feels true to us in terms of values. And so, I would never say I don't think there's value in scheduling those 30-minute catch-ups. And we do have other calls, right? Like we get on one-on-ones with various people, and I generally talk to everyone on the team pretty frequently. But in terms of that kind of water cooler stuff, it feels to me like people would have a harder time saying no to something that I'm suggesting than just giving them the option to do it. Sure. And saying I'm completely open to being around. So I don't think either one of them is perfect, but for me the less problematic one, I guess, is the optional one.
Gotcha.
Perhaps let's ask about the tools that Minaal uses, for project management, documentation, messaging, and most importantly, do you have the Giphy plugin in your Slack if you're using Slack?
Oh, if I didn't, the world would be a much bleaker place. The Giphy plugin is the only thing getting me through the Corona crisis. So we have, I think, I would imagine, a reasonably standard and boring tech stack. So our project management and collaboration is in Asana. We do use some other tools when it makes sense. So some things really suit Kanban style, so we use Trello for that. It felt weird for a while not having everything housed in one platform, but I think we found on balance it was better to use the right tool for the right job, even if it meant more tools, than it was just trying to ram everything into a tool that didn't fit. Occasionally Trello or some other tools. We use Quip, which is owned by Salesforce, as our documentation. So it's basically like in my opinion, better Google Docs. It's it's much more buggy than I would expect from a company that's been acquired by Salesforce, but it is good, or it's better than the other options from what I've experienced. And then Slack, we use Slack, we use Zoom for the calls. And I think those are the main ones at the moment. And obviously email But we try and avoid email unless it's something we want to live on, or unless it's something external, right? Unless we're talking to people who aren't in our Slack, aren't internal for us. And we work with a lot of partners who are much more old school, right? It's a manufacturing supply chain. So we're not going to get our manufacturing facility into our Slack as a single channel guest. We're not going to get our warehouse in Hong Kong or our warehouse in Idaho into that same Slack. So we have to be pretty flexible because I think partly because we're vertically integrated. We have to adapt to whatever partners we're working with at whatever stage of the chain. So those are the tools I feel like I spend most time in. I mean, obviously my calendar as well, but apart from that, that's the main tech stack.
Nice, cool. As a last wrap up question, apart from managing the current situation where you have, as you said in the beginning, shorter reaction times and so on, what do you see on the horizon will be maybe the learnings and the changes and challenges to come, just based on what's currently happening, and also where Minaal and your company is at this point in time for the next 12 to 24 months?
Well, this is maybe a little more existential than you were intending the question to be, but I think right now, I mean, we are a travel industry company, and we are experiencing a travel industry that is, let's call it, at zero. And so I think for us, we've always kind of preached diversification, and not only in business, but in terms of personal lives, being interested in a lot of things. And so since this all started, I mean, we've launched a radio station. We're starting to share our supply chain with people who need extra capacity in the supply chain or are having struggles with it. So I think there's a lot of appetite for doing new things, and we're looking at that as a pretty urgent thing, because who knows when travel's coming back.
That's very smart. I like it. I got to check out your radio station.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
This was really fun and great information. Thank you, Jimmy, for taking the time. And I have a ton more questions, but we'll get to a part 2 sometime later. I hope so. Stay safe.
Sounds good. Cheers.